Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is so nice to have you tonight at Scholé Academy's lecture hall. I'm going to give everyone some time to enter. You can see Heidi White. She's here with us. And I'll be making formal introductions and give kind of a rundown of what you can expect tonight. But as you're coming in, we do have some features here that you can take advantage of. So I'm going to pass it to Christy Stoddard, who is our new Culture and Events Coordinator at Scholé Academy. And she's going to share with you just a little bit of some tips on how you can participate tonight. So Christy, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So if you notice at the bottom of your screen, more on the left-hand side, there's a little chat icon. Why doesn't everybody go ahead and introduce themselves and tell us where they're from while we're just waiting for everybody else to join? During the lecture that Heidi White gives us, if you have questions that you'd like her to answer at the end, because we are going to have a formal Q&A session at the end, please type those questions into the Q&A icon that you see more on the right-hand side of the bottom icons, and that way we can find them and access them a lot easier than trying to search through the chat. If you have problems with volume or audio or anything like that, if you make an announcement in the chat, I will see that and I will try to help you. Other than that, I think that's all we've got. Enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Christy. So when it comes to our Scholé Academy lecture hall, I never know as we're looking at the registrants who are coming tonight, how you necessarily found us. So I know some of you are Scholé Academy families, but many of you are followers of Heidi White. So some of you might not be familiar with Scholé Academy and our mission and vision. So I just want to take a moment and briefly introduce our school. Scholé Academy is an educational service line within Classical Academic Press. Started in 2014, very small, 2 classes, Latin and Logic, and about 8 students. And through the revival of classical Christian education and the thriving homeschool community, Scholé Academy found that we resonated with a lot of families. And so currently this year, we're serving over 2,000 students. And we work with families in North America and overseas. And so we're just grateful. We offer over 140 unique courses, and we have 3 houses of studies that allows our students, if they would like, to study certain courses in their own specific Christian tradition. And our 3 houses serve the Orthodox community, the Anglican community, and the Catholic community. So if you are not familiar with Scholé Academy, Christy can go ahead and put our school website in the chat box and you can come and check us out. And then the Scholé Academy lecture hall started a couple years ago, and it was, or we're hoping that it's a outreach to our community, to our parents, to educators, to school administrators, to moms, dads, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever is participating in the homeschooling in the home, or maybe you're a teacher in a local school. And so we look for speakers like Heidi White and others who are sharing with us their wisdom, their love for the classical tradition. And we hope that each time we bring a speaker in, they are touching on a topic that's meaningful to you, that you walk away with a practical tip or insight. But really, I would say what excites me most about our Scholé Academy lecture hall is that we hope it is something that you can come to and find refreshment, find a place where you can be rejuvenated, where your soul, your intellect, your heart can be filled with something that you can take away and bring back into your home, your school, your co-op, whoever the people are that you work with in regards to the work you're doing in classical Christian education. So with that, let's get to the fun part. I am so excited to introduce you to Heidi White. I had the privilege of meeting her for the first time last summer, and I was just telling her, she gave a beautiful talk on a great book, and she'll remember it for me when she talks in just a moment. But her lecture just really touched me and I'm sure many others in the audience. So I wanted to bring her to the lecture hall so that she could provide us with another beautiful lecture that allows us to be formed by her wisdom and her experience. So Heidi White is a teacher, podcaster, author, and homeschooling mother. She teaches humanities at St. Hilde's School in Colorado Springs. She's the author of the forthcoming The Divided Soul, Reuniting Duty and Desire in Literature and Life. She's a contributing author, speaker, and atrium instructor at the Circe Institute and a weekly contributor on the Close Reads podcast. She serves on the board of directors of the Anselm Society, as well as the academic advisory board for the classical learning test. She writes fiction, poetry, essays, and she speaks about literature, education, and the Christian imagination. She lives in Black Forest, Colorado with her husband and children. So Heidi, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh gosh, are you kidding? Thank you, Joanne. And I remember well chatting with you after my talk at the Sorcery Institute. And I definitely remember thinking that you have some of the most beautiful hair I've ever seen in my whole life, but that's kind of a girl thing, you know? So anyway, thank you so much for having me. And I really resonated so much with what you said just a couple of minutes ago about our need as educators for the refreshment of the soul. I know that you and the people who are attending tonight are just continually pouring out, and we also need to be refreshed, and that's part of the classical tradition, right? That need for our souls to be nourished. That's what we're giving out, hopefully by God's grace, to our students. And so of course we need that. And probably, I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but definitely for me, I felt like as a classical educator, I am redeeming my own lost education, my own broken education, my own modern wasteland education through educating my students and my children. And that's so refreshing to my soul. And so I'm continually looking for those streams to pour into me, as well as hoping to be able to offer that to others. So anyway, I just really resonated with that. And thank you for providing this platform for people to be able to receive those who are giving. So tonight I am going to talk about Virtuous Delight, Beauty and Temperance, from Socrates to C.S. Lewis. And I was telling my husband the other day, like, I'm giving this webinar and it's definitely not one that I can put off to the last minute because those are really specific things. And so it's been such a joy to do this research and writing for this project. And I've been learning so much. So I'm eager to share what I have been learning from the tradition about this. So I'm going to start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and read you a passage from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is after Edmund and Lucy return from Narnia, before Peter and Susan have joined them there. And Edmund denies that he's been there, right? Because Edmund is still a jerk. He's not yet converted, right? And he bullies Lucy, who stoutly asserts the truth of her adventure. So Peter and Susan go and seek Professor Kirke's advice. And this is what Professor Kirke says to them. Beginning on page 55, I'm going to read about a page. He says, he asks them, who is the more truthful, right? Edmund or Lucy in general? And says, well, said Susan, in general, I'd say the same as Peter, that it's Lucy every time. But this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn. That is more than I know, said the professor, and a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it mightn't even be lying, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean? Said the professor quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. And for the moment then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go to the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor, and Peter did not quite know what to say. I'm going to skip a little bit. And then Peter asks him this question. He says, but do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just round the corner like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself. I wonder what they do teach them at these schools. And I'll end there. And this, the reason I read such a lengthy page and a half here at the beginning is because this in story form is the essence of C.S. Lewis's educational vision. Now, if you think about it, this is a very remarkable education vision indeed, because through Professor Kirke, Lewis claims a couple of really big philosophical points. He claims A, the principles of logic, and B, transcendent spiritual realities are connected to one another, and that it is impossible to be intellectually honest without acknowledging the possibility of realer things beyond our comprehension, and that clues to those realer things are hidden in plain sight all around us all the time. And most radical of all, that it is the job of education to teach us how to seek and find those clues to a world beyond ourselves. In The Last Battle, Professor Kirke is even more explicit than that. And I'm going to read you just a short paragraph from there that's very relevant to this conversation. This is at the very end of the story. He says this, listen, Peter, when Aslan said you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia you were thinking of, but that was not the real Narnia. At this point, Narnia has ended, has been destroyed, and the children have found themselves in a new land. Looks exactly like Narnia, but even better. Right? That Narnia had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here. Just as our own world, England and all, is only a shadow or copy of something in Aslan's real world. You need not mourn over Narnia, Lucy. All of the old Narnia that mattered, all our dear creatures, have been drawn into the real Narnia through the door. And of course it is different as a real thing is from a shadow, or as waking life is from a dream. It's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach at these schools? So what Professor Kirke is saying here is that we live in the Shadowlands, but someday we will encounter the real world. In Book 6 of the Republic, now we're going to go way back. In Book 6 of the Republic, Socrates tells the famous allegory of the cave. It's actually Book 7. It's Book 7 of the Republic. He tells the very famous allegory of the cave. And here it is. He says, imagine, he says, that everybody in the whole world lives underground in a cave, that we are chained in place facing a blank, bare rock wall. And behind us is a blazing fire that we cannot see. And in front of the fire, there are puppet masters are putting on a puppet show. So the fire casts the shadows of the puppet show onto the rock wall. So all us prisoners in the cave, ever see are those flickering shadows. So of course, we who are prisoners in the cave believe that the shadows are real. How can we not believe that, right? That's all we can see. We've never seen the real world. But imagine further, Socrates goes on, that a man, a prisoner, somehow manages to cast off his chains and find his way above ground. And when he first emerges, his eyes will be dazzled and he'll be unable to see anything. But soon his senses, which were actually made for that world, the real world, will adjust, and he will see and feel and taste and touch and hear the real world, the rocks, the trees, the water, the plants, the birds, the sky, the weather, all of it that his actual body was made for, he'll experience for the first time. And he will delight in it because he will be living in the world that he was actually made for. And then, Socrates asserts, of course, he'll want to tell the other prisoners about it. So he will return to the cave and he will tell them. But then the story takes a turn, right? Because instead of welcoming this escaped prisoner, instead of welcoming the man who's actually seen the real world, the prisoners, of course, will think he is a madman. They will denounce him and they will kill him. And that will be the end. So Socrates intended the cave allegory as a metaphor for education. But of course, we Christians, right, we recognize something much deeper in this story. This really happened in living history, except that the man who descended into the cave was not an escaped prisoner at all, but the creator of the real world, who desired us to come out of the cave and make our way into the real world beyond the Shadowlands. But if we set aside the Christian allegory for a moment and focus on Socrates' intended allegory, it illuminates education in a really beautiful way. We cannot fulfill the ministry of Christ, of course. Only Christ can do that, and he has done that and is doing that, right? But in an educational sense, we are that man, that escaped prisoner. That is what Professor Kirke is saying when he says, it's all in Plato, it's all in Plato. What are they teaching at these schools? It's a funny line, it's a quip, right? But it's a real question that Lewis is asking. What are they teaching in these schools? Why are we being taught by the prisoners instead of the man coming out of the cave who has seen the real world and has his senses and his desires trained to be able to engage in the world he was truly made for, right? We, as classical educators, we have seen something bigger, something deeper, something better than the Shadowlands through the great tradition and through the life of Christ in the church. And we, of course, long to give that as an inheritance to our students. I know you all relate to that, right? Whether you're a homeschool mom or you are teaching in a classroom or you're running a school or a co-op or even just redeeming your own education, right? This is our longing. Once we encounter this, once we emerge from the cave, all we want to do is go back in and bring some prisoners out with us, right? Yes, but the cave dwellers, those who are still locked in prison, we're not any better than them by any means, right? Because this is where we have come from, right? But we prisoners still in the cave can't fully understand that, right? The best that we have ever seen is shadows flickering on bare rock, right? The muscles and the senses and the language of the prisoners are underdeveloped. And we see this in sharp relief right now in our culture all the time. We do not know what we are missing, which means that our affections are not trained to long for the real. Right? The prisoners are satisfied with shadows because they've never seen the things themselves. And that, says Socrates and Lewis, is the real job of the educator. Our job is to whet the appetite for the real. This is why Plato said in the Republic that the goal of an education is to love, right? Not to know, not to do, but to love. Right? Knowledge is and has always been a means to a greater end, which is love. And St. Paul says this in his first epistle to Timothy. In 1 Timothy 1:5, he says, the goal of our instruction is love. 1 Corinthians 13, these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And you might say that St. Paul means in these verses in the sense of loving God, which of course is true. But how can we love God if we do not love what God loves? He loves his creation, and we love him through it, especially since our destiny is to live and dwell with him beyond the shadowlands in paradise, which is the real world. We live right now in the cave of shadows, but our destiny is to dwell with God in the real world. And part of our Christian pilgrimage and part of our role as educators is to gain a taste for reality instead of shadows. The goal of an education is to love. But the quote is unfinished, right? The full quote is, the goal of an education is to love the beautiful. I'm going to read you a short passage from Plato's Republic. This is book 3, section 401E. If you are a Plato, if you read Plato, this is where you find it. This is the notation for you to find it. Book 3, section 401E. And the translator is Grube that I'm going to be reading. And this is Socrates speaking to his interlocutor Glaucon, he's having a conversation with this young man. And he says, aren't these the reasons, Glaucon, that education in music and poetry is most important? First, because rhythm and harmony permeate the inner part of the soul more than anything else, affecting it most strongly and bringing it grace, so that if someone is properly educated in music and poetry, it makes him graceful, but if not, then the opposite. Second, because anyone who has been properly educated in music and poetry will sense it acutely when something has been omitted from a thing and when it hasn't been finely crafted or finely made by nature. And since he has the right distastes, he'll praise the fine things, be pleased with them, receive them into his soul, and being nurtured by the beautiful, he will become fine and good. He'll rightly object to what is shameful, hating it while he's still young and unable to grasp the reason, but having been educated in this way, he will welcome the reason when it comes and recognize it easily because of his kinship with the beautiful. So, here we arrive at a very fundamental ingredient of love, and that is beauty. In the book, Ethics of Beauty, absolutely phenomenal book. Everyone's got to pick this book up. It's an investment. It's an investment in time. It's a very long book, and it's an investment of your finances. That's by author Dr. Timothy Petitsas. And he argues for a beauty-first approach to Christian discipleship. And I believe that Christian discipleship is exactly the same project as education, because it is the training of the soul towards the good. And he asserts that we come to the good and the true through the beautiful. So one of the great failures and irreparable losses in Western culture after the Enlightenment, and I know this because I'm teaching this right now in my classroom, and like I'm practically in tears every day, is the loss of the beautiful. Even my students, I've been making comments, not quite knowing necessarily the exact language that they're searching for. They don't know how to say, I'm missing the beautiful. Right? But they'll say things like, oh, this year when we're reading the Enlightenment philosophers, I just don't find the same joy in it. Why aren't we reading more stories? Why isn't there more poetry? Right? But what they're really saying is, where is the beautiful? Right? And they're longing for that. And that is one of the great losses in Western culture after the Enlightenment. And part of the work of Christian classical educators is to recover the place of the beautiful in the formation and the reformation of the soul. With our young students in their young ages, we are forming the soul. For us, after having kind of taken the plunge into understanding that the world is fallen, right? We are reforming our souls. And of course, those are permeable categories. Our children are fallen and we're still forming. But if education is for the formation, of the soul and the reformation of the soul, beauty is an integral part of that. And C.S. Lewis says something very similar in The Way of Glory. And if you haven't read this essay, it's much shorter than Ethics of Beauty, but it essentially says the same thing: run, don't walk, to get your hands on the Way of Glory. This essay, you can find it in PDF form online. And I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs here from Lewis that are very relevant. And he's talking about here the desire for heaven. And he says, quote, "If we are made for heaven, the desire for our proper place will be already in us, but not yet attached to the true object, and will even appear as the rival of that object." And I'm going to stop there and say, think about this in your own life. Perhaps you have been much holier than me and have never attached your eternal love for God on a lesser object, but I certainly have, on relationships, so there's so many things that I have had an eternal longing for God and have attached that eternal longing to a finite object, and then found myself disappointed and distorted in my love. And it is only when I recognize that it was always God through that object, that was always, so to speak, the lamppost pointing the way into Narnia, not Narnia itself, right? Then I can love that lamppost for what it is, because it invited me to love God better. And that's what Lewis is talking about here. And he says, if a transfinite good, he just coined that term there, if a transfinite good is our real destiny, then any other good on which our desire fixes must be in some degree fallacious, must bear at best only a symbolical relationship to what will truly satisfy. And in speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves even now, I feel a certain shyness. I am almost committing an indecency. I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each of you, the secret that hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when, in very intimate conversations, the mention of it becomes imminent and we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, although we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our circumstances. Our commonest expedient is to call it beauty and behave as if that settled the matter. Just a couple more sentences here. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing themselves, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the heart of their worshipers. This is what Plato is saying, and this is what Lewis is echoing, and this is what Christian thinkers, Augustine, church fathers have said down the ages. Just like Lewis said, it's all in Plato, right? St. Paul, so many of the great classical and medieval thinkers have said this same thing. We instinctively recognize, Socrates would say we recollect, right? That beauty is intrinsically connected to love. This is probably because beauty awakens desire, right? The ancients understood desire, specifically the painful awakening of desire through encountering beauty. And they portrayed that in the god Eros, who pierced vulnerable human hearts with his inescapable arrows, the wound of love, right? This painful awakening of desire through the lure of beauty was tended to be disordering in pagan mythology, right? But Socrates spoke of Eros as the only way to properly order the soul. And after the resurrection of our Lord, the church fathers, the mystics, and Christian philosophers agreed with Socrates. St. John Chrysostom, for example, calls Christ, quote, some ardent lover, or rather more ardent than any lover, end quote. And he speaks of the wound of Eros, saying, quote, I am wounded with love for God, end quote. He describes himself as painfully longing for union with God, as a beloved longs to be united with her lover. And of course, this echoes biblical language. The New Testament calls the church the bride of Christ. And many Old Testament references, such as Psalm 45, Hosea 11, the entire book of Song of Songs, are allegories of the eros between God and his people. This is common language in ancient and medieval Christianity, and it's largely lost in the West after the Enlightenment. So for most of human history, we have rightfully sought, not pushed away, the wound, the healing wound of love through encountering beauty. Now, this doesn't come without risk, of course, right? And this is why I think we've pushed away this wound in our own lives and generally as a culture, right? In the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus tells us the story of two brothers, right? The younger brother demands his inheritance in his youth, and he disappears and he squanders it on wild living. Meanwhile, the older brother stays dutifully at home. And I'll never forget Andrew Kern from the Circe Institute saying some words to me that totally changed my perspective on parenting and education and the longings of my own heart. He said, the problem is that most Christian parents are trying as hard as they can to raise the older brother, but it is the prodigal who is reconciled to the father in the parable. And that is true. It's the prodigal who repents. And it's probably because the prodigal has a capacity for delight, right? I think about this all the time. How do I create a culture in my home and in my classroom that increases my students, my children's, and my own appetite for delight, but also instills how to properly satisfy that appetite, right? How do I cultivate virtuous delight? So in 2 words, I believe that culture is characterized by beauty on one hand and temperance on the other, and that these are 2 parallel tracks that train the soul's affections to desire the real world beyond the shadowlands. So beauty. Dante says in the Divine Comedy that beauty awakens the soul to act. I love that. I'd like to get it tattooed on my forehead, right? If you're a Christian classical educator, you know all about beautiful things, right? I don't mean pretty things. In Ethics of Beauty, Dr. Batista said that beauty always carries a hidden cross. It makes us suffer by awakening a longing for something beyond ourselves. And that is eros, the wound of love. And that's why Handel's Messiah is beautiful, but pop music mostly isn't, right? And that's why Achilles dragging Hector's body around the walls of Troy, weeping for Patroclus, is beautiful, even though it's agonizing. But many things that are not beautiful carry a hidden cross, right? And how do we tell the difference? Well, without reducing something inarticulable and mysterious, the inconsolable secret, as Lewis calls it, to something technical, it's about awakened longing, right? Things that are not beautiful, like pop music or Cheetos or most movie adaptations of classic books, right? Not only fail to awaken the longing for transcendent, but they either attempt to fulfill it or deaden it with a lesser thing. And that's how you can tell the difference between something that's pretty and something that's beautiful. Right. The movie Troy, for example, it was okay, right? I don't know. It was pretty bad, right? It tried to tell the story of the Iliad without the gods, and it lost all of its beauty and became just another 2 hours of entertaining twaddle, right? It had no cross, no eros, no wound, no suffering for something beyond itself. But the Iliad does. The Iliad is painful, but very beautiful. So we should put true beauty, the wound of eros, the suffering longing for something holy and perfect but out of reach, at the center of education. We do not protect our children from the hidden cross. We give it to them on purpose. Right? Beauty is not difficult to find. Shakespeare, symphonies, Botticelli, Caravaggio, geometry, the stars, nature notebooking, baking bread, memorizing scripture, growing vegetables, right? The list goes on and on. If it is beautiful, if it is a real thing, Even if it's painful or difficult or hard to understand or requires work, it belongs there. Right? So, but beauty is as dangerous as it is necessary, as I said before. So we can see from the life of, then we can see this from the life of every addict who's ever lived, right? Most of us know someone or have struggled ourselves with addictions, right? A woman's body is beautiful, for example, but it carries a hidden cross. And that hidden cross is that men ought not to enjoy it or possess it if that beautiful woman is not his bride, right? That beauty is not for him, nor is it hers to squander. Pornography is ugly not because the women are ugly, but because pornography rejects the hidden cross of feminine sexuality, right? And that's true for addictions across the board. The wound of desire that could have been a healing wound unto salvation becomes a festering and a destructive one if we do not carry that hidden cross of the wound, right? Not all beauty is meant for us in the way that we want it. And that's the sad story of the prodigal son who squandered his beautiful inheritance on wild living and was unworthy of it and lost it and wounded himself. And this brings us to the second rail that cultivates virtuous delight. Along with beauty, we need temperance. Temperance is the ability to limit desire according to the good. It's not a virtue rooted only in duty, but also in desire. When we are temperate, our delight becomes more delightful, right? For example, I'm not eating any white refined sugars this year, sugar-free 23. It's only been a couple of weeks, but yesterday I took a sip of my son's like fresh mango juice with no added sugar, and it tasted so good, right? The rich sweetness on my tongue was this like sensuously delightful experience because my taste buds hadn't been recently overwhelmed and deadened by the lesser thing, the unreal thing, the shadow, right? I only took that one sip because it wasn't mine, and it might have been the best moment of my day. That temperance made my delight so much more concentrated, more acute, more appreciative, more satisfying. And of course, that's just food, right? The stakes aren't that high. Nobody has to do that. But on the other hand, that's where Christ tells us to begin. Temperance is one reason why the scriptures command Christians to fast. A priest once said in an adult Sunday school that I was a part of that if we want our children to be chaste, we should put them in piano lessons. And I love that. It's a practical way of saying what I have been saying in this like very long-winded lecture, right? That beauty and temperance orient the soul to eternity. In piano lessons, the music is beautiful and the practicing is temperate. And that develops chastity in all areas of life, not just sexual, right? Because chastity is the proper ordering of eros, right? Chastity is the harmony of desire. When we are chaste, we know how to suffer for what is better, when to say yes and when to say no. We know that if we want to play beautiful music, we have to practice. If we want beautiful marriages, we have to forsake all others. If we want beautiful minds, we have to study and struggle, right? And all of this is merely a framework to say what Plato and Lewis have been saying all along, that there is a better world, that we are made for that world, and that we can find glimpses of it here through beauty, and that we can develop worthiness of it through virtuous action. And ancient and medieval thinkers believed that the pilgrimage of the Christian life is to be made fit for heaven. So what this looks like in reality as educators is actually pretty simple, though not necessarily easy. Number one, we extravagantly fill our curriculum with beautiful things, just beauty everywhere we can get it. And number two is that we hold our students accountable to the content and quality of their work, and that is temperance. Right. So if you're already doing this, like wonderful, be encouraged and carry on. Consider this just a pep talk, right? If you have a million ideas right now on things you want to change or do, I encourage temperance. Think of it as simple math, right? Addition and subtraction. This is how I develop new habits in my life, because I am naturally a very intemperate, desire-driven person. I am a prodigal all the way, right? So I'm constantly looking for ways to develop this virtue in my life. So in a month, add one beautiful thing or temperate practice, just one, and subtract a lesser thing or a practice. It's that simple. Example, like add reading a poem at the breakfast table, subtract looking at iPhones at the breakfast table, right? Like add listening to books in the car, subtract listening to mindless pop or whatever in the car, right? If it's good, I'm not saying you can't sometimes have the Cheetos, right? Eat the Cheetos occasionally, just don't nourish yourselves on them completely. So take this, however your soul, family, or classroom can benefit from it, but resist the temptation to do too much too fast, right? That's not temperate. Chances are, honestly, you're probably already doing a great job, and this whole thing is just a pep talk to hang in there, and that's it. This is a manageable, temperate pathway to accustoming yourself and your students to any changes you feel like you need to make. And also remember that if you're showing up, you're doing a great work, right? After all, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a sincere faith. So I'm going to close here really quickly and then open it up to questions. I'm going to close with the words of St. Augustine, right? Or Augustine, right? A good Christian Platonist who understood the healing wound of Eros. And he says in his sermon on love, he says, love God and do what you want. All right. That is all I have to say in the formal part, but I will pass it back to you ladies and you tell me how you want to handle the Q&A.
Thank you, Heidi. I've been taking notes fast and furious, and I'm sure everyone in the audience has been doing the same. I've seen a couple questions come in through the Q&A, so I know there's so much to digest and think about right now. So as you're doing that, everyone, if you have a question, remember you can put it in the Q&A. We've made some, or I should say we've taken what Heidi has mentioned regarding authors and books that she's quoted from tonight. So we've put that in the chat box as well, just for kind of points of reference that you can return to. I know I heard some books that I haven't read yet, so I'm going to add that to my reading list. So there's a lot here for us to take away tonight. But yeah, let's jump into questions. And remember, you've got, if for some reason the Q&A piece is not working for you, you've got the chat box and you can put comments in there as well. Christy's going to help me navigate all of this. But let's go to the first question. So the question is, at what age developmental phase should children be introduced to the hidden cross? And she gives some specifics. Thinking of Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, which is a children's catechism formation program. There's not a work that allows the children to recreate the crucifixion. She says at least not at the level of CGS for ages 4 to 12. There's not a manipulative work of the Passion. So how might we bring that into discussion with our littles?
I really think that's such a good question, because I'm sure you all remember, if you've read The Hiding Place, there's a really beautiful example of this when young Corrie ten Boom asks her father about sexuality. And he tells her, uses the analogy of a suitcase, and he says, I do not give you what is too heavy for you to carry. I carry it for you, right? And that is, when we talk about the hidden cross of beauty, we do not mean that to give a child more than they can carry within the suffering of the world, right? Because the suffering of the world is very deep, and sometimes I feel like that cross is too heavy even for me. I grieve so much for this world, and we don't want to put that on our children's shoulders. But we want to, and there's so many amazing practical resources, Ambleside Online, right? Different curricula that has age appropriate great books and studies for our children. I'm sure many of us are following along with those. And those are the people who've created that have done that very thoughtfully. So we don't want to sanitize that, right? So if we're reading a fairy tale, for example, don't take out the Wicked Witch. Don't take out, don't get rid of that, because children, they recognize that, right? They know that they are fallen and they know the world is a hard place. And so when they encounter a story that is developmentally appropriate, that actually acknowledges that, there's a sense of security in that. Oh my goodness, this story knows what I know, that the world is hard, but it also gives us a resurrection. Look for the stories that have the hidden cross and also a sense of hope, a sense of restoration, the knowledge that something better is coming, that there is a better world. And so especially for a child, and even for us adults, man, I need that resurrection piece in a lot of in art as well. So look also for art for your children, and a curriculum for your children that offers the cross, but offers a compelling resurrection piece along with that hidden cross. And that will teach them the world is fallen, but that Christ has overcome the world. Take heart, right? That Christ has overcome the world, and just follow along. You can trust those curriculum that you find within the classical education tradition, that we're all kind of like relying on those book lists and things like that. People are really thoughtful about that.
Thank you. As you were talking about how to bring in the hidden cross, how to do this with our students, I was and doing that through stories or art, but we recently had a college panel, and part of that discussion was talking about the atmosphere of the classroom and the posture of the teacher or the professor, and not seeing the classroom kind of as like a performance, and helping our students not to see the classroom as a place where they need to perform. And so I was just thinking and connecting it to how the educator, I think it was earlier in your talk, you posed that question, like, you know, when we're looking at education now with a critical eye, and we say, like, why are we being taught by the teachers who only see the shadows? And then I was thinking again of the authentic professor. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how best ways to kind of share your life as an educator so that they see that you are authentically being transformed by beauty. It's not just like, oh, kids, let's sit down and read this story and then tell me what you learned from it. Or, you know, like, you can trying to make it authentic in that experience.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm experiencing this now in my teaching. I have all teenage students, and they ask me questions all the time that I don't know or have not thought of, or I'm unsure, right? You know, we're reading the Meno right now in my ancient literature class, and the question is, can virtue be taught? And frankly, I have no idea. I think about that every day of my whole life, and I think that it must. I think it can't be taught. I think it must be chosen, but then what do we do with the fact that people don't know what it is until they're told, right? So, you know, these are questions. And so I think, to your point, you just say exactly what Socrates said, which is, I don't know. What a good question. Man, we're both on the same journey. I love that question. And then ask, and then, you know, and then enter into the conversation. Every time you say that, maybe like be willing to stop, because we're not all about covering material, right? We are, maybe stop in the middle of teaching and say, I love that question. I'm not sure. What do you think? Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? You can do that with really young kids, even. I wouldn't do it with like necessarily always with kindergartners or whatever. We're wise and discerning, but use your discernment, and then don't let a kid hijack the conversation because he knows that you'll get caught up in every conversation. Sometimes you can say, we'll put a pin on this. We're going to talk about this later or whatever. But the point is that if you don't know, say you don't know. And then also, just like you said, share your life with your students, because as David Hicks says in Norms of Nobility, which is another book that every classical educator should struggle their way through. It's a challenging read that first time, but worth it. And he says that divine love, eros, between teacher and student is the source of all virtue in learning. Right? My job, my one job, is to love my students and to love the books or the curriculum that I'm teaching. For me, it is the great books. For you, it might be something different, right? To love it And if I love my students, and if I love that thing that I'm teaching, if it has been awakened in Eros in me, that healing wound of love, then those conversations are no longer threats, but opportunities to engage in the real conversation, which is about the heart, right? And about training the affections. So just say, I don't know, and then share something about your life. Don't overshare and always end with resurrection, right? If you're depressed, you might not want to share just that with your students. You might want to say them, but I'm, like add the hope, but be honest about the struggle.
Thank you. We have another question here to kind of go back a little bit and maybe define the hidden cross. But the question is, the hidden cross / beauty carries a hidden cross. Were you referring to the hidden cross metaphorically, as in sacrifice pain, or literally the story of the cross, redemption, which is inherently what we long for because we're human and made with a longing for our Creator?
I really love this question. Hi, Tracy. I think I meant both for sure. But I think that I think they're one and the same, right? I think every sacrificial suffering in a story or in a piece of art is a metaphor for the cross, right? And I think that's what I think that's what Dr. Petit says is getting at in Ethics of Beauty, and what certainly what Lewis is getting at. And even by inference a bit, Plato is certainly pre-Christian. He wasn't a Christian, but he acknowledged that pain and death is intrinsically a part of beauty. And he wondered about that. Why is that? He wondered. And the answer is because of the cross, right? And we instinctively respond to that. We know that everything must die in order to be reborn, and that the natural world teaches us, just like stories teach us that, right? A seed has to die in order for it to be reborn. That's the metaphor that's used in 1 Corinthians 15 about heaven, about our longing for heaven. I guess, Tracy, I mean both, and I don't know that I think it's very important to distinguish between the two or try to spiritualize things. Meaning I don't think we have to go into every book and be like, where is the part where Jesus dies in the metaphor? Like, I just think that we receive the pain and take it and allow it to be transformed into a longing for heaven, a longing for the truth.
Thank you. There's a little bit of chatter to try to answer your question you asked earlier
Can
about
virtue be taught?
Yeah,
it's a
about
distracting
virtue.
question, right? Every time that one comes out, my brain's like, like
so they're kind of providing some answers there. You can see that.
That's probably the most relevant question for classical educators, right? And in many, for those of you who've read the Meno and discussed it, and I see you all talking about Dr. Bianca there, that in the Meno, he a bit dodges the question at the end, and people get frustrated. My students always get frustrated, and I always tell them, I think he does that because he wants us to wrestle with it. Right? Because once we start asking, can virtue be taught? Who gets the responsibility? The teacher, right? That question is already making a judgment that it's the teacher's responsibility, right? And one of the things that Socrates does in the Meno is to shift the ground of the conversation and to say, and he says to Meno, you and I must think about bettering our own souls, right? And this is why it's such a good dialogue to teach to our students, because then we can shift that ground onto them and say, how will you acquire virtue? Instead of just relying on me to teach it, because I don't know if virtue can be taught or not. So
when you were talking about the allegory of the cave, I was thinking, what are the shadows for our modern students, or the things that our teachers face? And so I was starting to write a list, and so I was kind of curious as to how you might respond to that question of what are the shadows. I was thinking obvious things like the Spark Note summary versus actually reading the book, or like you mentioned, the film versus the book. But in all honesty, what are some of the shadows that you've encountered over the years as teaching, where you've realized, oh, like here's actually what I need to give them and not this. And we were focusing on this. Was wondering if maybe you could unpack some of those memories that you have.
Right. I think that's man, I really love that question. I'm going to try not to rant too much because I care way more about beauty than I do about shadows. But I think probably right now in this cultural moment, the biggest threat to our students and our own love and longing for the beautiful is the internet, right? And it's also a great tool. We're on it right now. This is how we're connected, right? And if virtue is the distinguishing between what is beneficial to the soul and what is harmful to the soul, as Socrates says in the Meno, then the internet can be beneficial to the soul, but we also have to know our students are not wise. Right. And so I think for me, the biggest threat that I have seen to my student souls has been the improper use of this incredibly powerful tool of knowledge. And especially right now, AI, ChatGPT, I think is one of the most wicked things that has ever been created by man. And if you don't know what that is, go look it up. And it is going to rob our students of any kind of meaningful, creative efforts unless we stop it. And I think also, as Tracy said, the pursuit of test scores, right? Putting performance over the love of beauty, and reducing education to merely a means to a marketable end. How can I get these grades? How can I get into college so I can get a good job? That mindset of education is the mindset of shadows. It is the pursuit of shadows. And if, as Aristotle says, the telos, or the ultimate goal, the end, the purpose of an acorn is an oak tree, right? That's what it is. The purpose of an acorn is an oak tree. The purpose of an acorn is not a wooden table, right? And so to take test scores, getting into good college, becoming a marketable presence in an economy is the goal of an education, then we have just said the goal of an education is the goal of a person is not to become, and the goal of an acorn is not to become an oak tree, but to become something made out of wood. And that's not true, right? And so it's our job as educators to keep bringing our students back to the love of the beautiful. We can't make them love the beautiful. We can just trust that if we give them the beautiful, they will love it because they're humans and that's how our souls are made. So I would say definitely the internet and definitely performance and the economy. And we all as Americans, we already know these things. Classical educators are constantly trying to figure out, how do I combat the zeitgeist, right? And I don't know if we can fully we can't remove ourselves from it. Our students are going to have all of the virtues and vices of this generation, right? However, we can attempt to crowd it out, right, as best we can. And as Alex is pointing out, the life of the church, the life of Christ, right? Education is not the be all end all. Education, again, is the project of education is the formation of the soul towards the good, and that is for our soul's salvation, right? So we're not just trying to form intellectuals. That's not our goal either. This isn't just about the life of the mind. It is about the beautiful being that beauty first approach takes us into loving what is better, right? So we as teachers, we need to get out of our heads that we are trying to make our kids know Socrates the best. Who cares, right? The only point of Socrates is so that they can love the good. If they love the good already, they don't need to know everything, right? So orient our teaching. The life of the mind is a means to the life of the soul, right? So we have to be careful that we're not pursuing shadows as well. Our students will pick up on that.
Well, I know we're already at the top of the hour, but I just want to make sure we're hitting all of the questions here. Molly has made a comment. Reason uncoupled from passion leads to what? Stoicism? I don't remember the heresy. I don't know if you can comment on that, or Molly, if there was a question you were following up with.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think that that's right. like that reason uncoupled from passion, another way of saying duty separated from desire, right? It leads to the older brother, right? And the problem with the older brother is that he won't come to the feast. He won't open his heart to delight.
Yeah.
And that is that whole question of reason. And, you know, if you're looking for a great book that explores that, it's the brothers Karamazov with the character Ivan, and that the life of the heart and the soul is represented by the brother Alyosha, whereas the life of the passions and the appetites is represented by the brother Dmitri, and how the tragedy unfolds in this family from the brother who refuses to delight himself, and then the brother who refuses to do any kind of meaningful duty, and the destruction that comes from that. And then the redemption that can come from a united soul, right? And so the writers of these stories, they are out there. We don't have to break our backs to find the beautiful. It's available. Just go out and pluck the fruit. It's there.
Thank you.
Can I just answer Nicole's question really quickly?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
So Nicole, what I said was that Ivan, the intellectual brother, he represents the life of reason uncoupled from desire, duty uncoupled from desire, and he pursues only the life of the mind, and what happens to him because of that. And Alyosha, the youngest brother, he is a united soul, right? He understands and lives by both. He's the man of the heart, the man of the chest, in Plato's terms. And then Dmitri is the brother who is led by appetites in the flesh, entirely by desire, without any duty. And you see the consequences of that in each of their lives and in their communities. So thank you for allowing me that last comment, Joanne.
Oh, of course. I needed that repeated as well, so thank you. One last question. Where does calculus fit in, especially if we're at a joyless point?
Right. Yes.
What can you say?
Right. No, I really actually love this question so much, because I don't want to say most, I don't want to speak, I think that's probably too strong. Many of the classical educators I know love the humanities and do kind of struggle through some of these more abstract and very specific, right? There's a right answer and a wrong answer, and you got to know how to do it. Calculus is, I mean, that is the virtue of temperance and action, right? Is learning math, right? But it's not only for temperance. There is a beauty to math. And so anytime you can bring in something embodied that's connected to what you're teaching in math, for example, today, my son in his physics class, his physics teacher brought in this like cool, like sand wave thing that like you put like certain frequencies on this little table and it shakes like the sand that was on top of it, and it makes like these beautiful patterns. And then they did the calculations, the mathematical calculations, using calculus to figure out what was going on there. And so there's this connection between the mathematics was embodied in some way. Socrates uses math all the time, but he always embodies it, right? As best you can, try to connect. And that's actually, I think, a really useful and virtuous use of the internet, right? You can go find these like amazing videos on YouTube, just like calculus in action or something like that. And it'll like show you all these really cool things. And I think that that's one of those uses of the internet that can be very redemptive, is seeing people who really do know how to put math in action and to make stuff out of it. And they make stuff out of it. My son watches that all the time. And that's part of his math curriculum is I'll give him a concept and I'll go find a YouTube video and show it to me that shows how somebody made something out of this. So that I think that's somewhat helpful. But really a lot of it is like just that temperance, that diligence to stick to it, and to know that we're not all about covering material. We are about the formation of the soul. And so it's okay if they need to take their time. That's why that is okay.
Thank you, Heidi. This has just been such a great evening for everyone, I think, and just looking at the comments that are coming in. Any last words or kind of thoughts that you want to share with us before we start to wrap up?
No, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was such a delight to be here. And I hope I actually feel like those nourishing to my own soul, just to be able to interact with this thoughtful conversation. So thank you for creating a platform and a community for that.
Well, you're welcome. But again, it's such a pleasure for us to have you here. And thank you, Christy, for being a part of tonight and making sure everything goes well. And then thank you to our audience. I know we've got Scholé Academy teachers and families out there, and then friends of Heidi that are joining us, and then names that I don't recognize. So like I said at the start of tonight, if you want to find us online and connect with anyone here tonight, you can also email support@scholeacademy.com. And then, of course, I encourage you to follow up with Heidi. We shared some information on our events page as well that allows you to find access to Heidi. Heidi, I don't know if you have kind of a general email or anything that you want to share with the audience. We can do that as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to type in my email. Feel free to send anything my way. I will say I'm not great at like lengthy email responses. I will get to it, but it might take me a little bit. I'd probably just respond and say, I love this. I'll come to this, but I do really enjoy conversations and feedback, recommendations on books. I'm a student, right? Like, I don't know if virtue can be taught, but I am a student of it. I would like to learn it. So please send me your thoughts and comments. And I just want to thank you for your encouragement that you posted in the chat. It really does touch my heart. So thank you very much for being here and listening and interacting.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. Again, it was great to see you. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Have a good evening. God bless. Bye-bye.